Jake Morrison's pickaxe bounced off the frozen feed like he was hitting solid concrete. Sparks flew. His hands went numb from the impact. 28 dairy cows were bellowing in their stalls, stomachs empty, udders full and aching. And here he was, 4:30 in the morning in his Wisconsin barn, attacking 40 bushels of grain that had transformed overnight into a block harder than stone. He swung again. The metal clanged uselessly. A tiny chip broke free, maybe 2 ounces of feed. At this rate, he'd be here until noon just to feed his herd once. His mortgage payment was due in 3 weeks. His milk production was already down 15% from fighting this same battle every morning for the past 2 weeks. Another month of this, and he'd lose the farm his father had bought in 1938. The thermometer outside read 18 below zero, inside the barn, maybe 10 above if you were lucky. This was January 1953, and the cold had arrived in November and simply refused to leave. Week after week of sub-zero temperatures that turned everything into iron. Water pumps froze solid, diesel fuel gelled in tractor tanks, and feed, that precious feed that kept dairy cows producing milk, that kept families fed and farms alive, that feed was freezing into unusable bricks every single night. Jake threw the pickaxe down and leaned against the feed bin, breathing hard. His neighbor Tom Hendrickson had lost his entire herd last winter when he couldn't solve this exact problem. Couldn't feed them properly, milk production crashed, couldn't make payments, bank foreclosed. Tom was working in a factory in Milwaukee now. His wife had cried at the auction when they sold everything. That wasn't going to be Jake. He wouldn't let it. But what could he do? He'd tried everything he could think of. He'd moved the feed bins. He'd covered them with blankets. He'd even tried heating the feed room with a kerosene heater until Helen told him he was going to burn the barn down, and then where would they be? Nothing worked. Every morning, the same nightmare, frozen solid. He grabbed a shovel and started scraping at the edges where the feed was slightly less frozen. His 3 kids were still asleep in the house. His wife Helen was probably starting breakfast. They had no idea how close they were to losing everything. He hadn't told them. What would he say? That he was being defeated by frozen grain? That something as simple as cold weather was going to take their home? By 6:30, he'd managed to scrape together enough feed for morning milking. His shoulders screamed in pain. His fingers were so cold he could barely feel them. The cows ate hungrily, but he could see it in their eyes, in their posture. They were stressed, uncomfortable. Production was going to drop even more. He finished milking by 8:15, loaded the milk cans into his truck and headed to town. The roads were treacherous, packed snow and ice everywhere. Main Street in Viroqua was nearly deserted. He dropped his milk cans at the cooperative, and then, instead of heading straight home like usual, he parked outside Henderson's Feed and Hardware. Inside, a group of farmers stood around the potbelly stove. Jake recognized most of them. Henry Schmidt, whose farm was over in the next valley, the Patterson brothers from north of town, old Doc Merrill, the veterinarian. They looked up when Jake walked in. His face must have shown everything because Henry spoke first. "You got the freeze up." It wasn't a question. Jake pulled off his cap and beat the frost from it. "Spent 90 minutes with a pickaxe this morning just to get one feeding. I can't keep doing this. I'm losing milk production. I'm losing money. I'm going to lose my farm if I can't figure this out." The men exchanged glances. Then Henry Schmidt walked to the counter, grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil, and came back. "Sit down," Henry said. "We're going to teach you what your grandfather should have taught you, but probably didn't because he farmed in Iowa where winters don't get like this." What happened over the next 45 minutes changed everything. The first thing Henry explained was moisture. That's your real enemy, not the cold. The cold is just doing what cold does. But moisture in your grain, that's what's binding everything into a solid mass. When water freezes, it expands and locks all those grain particles together like cement. You following me? Jake nodded. So here's what you need to understand. You can't fight this with heat. You don't have enough heat. Even if you did, you'd just create condensation, which makes more moisture, which makes the problem worse. You have to fight this with systems. Robert Patterson leaned forward. "How much moisture you figure was in your corn at harvest?" "I don't know. Maybe 20%? It was late September. Wet, I had to take it or lose it. There's your problem. That corn went into storage wet, now it's frozen. Even when this cold snap breaks, you're going to have mold problems if you just let it thaw. Doc Merrill tapped his pipe on the stove. But that's next month's problem. Right now you need to feed your cows today, tomorrow, next week. So here's what you're going to do. And you're going to do all of it, not just pick and choose. The solution wasn't one thing, it was a system. Multiple strategies working together. First, house storage. Jake needed to stop thinking about keeping all his feed in the barn. The house had a back porch, cool but above freezing. He needed to bring 3 days' worth of feed into the house every single evening. Put it in crocks, milk cans, wooden boxes, whatever he had. That feed would never freeze. That was his working supply. "But that's hauling feed into my house every day," Jake protested. "Yes, it is," Henry said flatly. "And it takes maybe 15 minutes. How long did you spend with that pickaxe this morning?" Jake shut up. Second, elevated storage in the barn. Cold air sinks. Heat rises. Animal heat from 28 cows rises through the barn all night. If Jake's feed was sitting on the concrete floor, it was sitting in the coldest possible spot. He needed to build a platform, get his feed bins 3 or 4 feet off the ground. Up there, in the rising warm air from the cattle, the temperature might be 15 degrees warmer. That could be the difference between feed that's cold and usable versus feed that's frozen solid. Third, smaller containers. Stop storing everything in 2 giant bins. Break it up. Use milk cans, wooden boxes, anything that held 20 or 30 pounds instead of hundreds of pounds. Smaller masses froze less solid, thawed faster if they did freeze, and were manageable even if frozen. Fourth, and this is what none of them had known until last winter, salt. Agricultural salt mixed into the feed at about 2 pounds per 100 pounds of feed. The salt absorbed moisture and lowered the freezing point. It was a trick farmers in Minnesota had been using for years. "Wait," Jake said. "That's simple, just mix in salt." "It's not magic," Henry said. "It doesn't keep it from freezing entirely when it's 20 below, but it keeps it from freezing into a solid brick. You can still work with it." Fifth, timing. The coldest part of every day was just before dawn. The warmest part in the barn was late afternoon when the cows had been inside all day generating heat. So if Jake needed to transfer feed, break up frozen sections, rotate his supply, he did it at 4 or 5 in the evening, not at 4 in the morning. Jim Henderson, who owned the feed store and had been listening from behind the counter, spoke up. "I got agricultural salt in stock, 25-pound bags, and I got some extra milk cans in the back from farmers who switched to bulk tanks. You can have them for 50 cents each." Jake did quick math in his head. Salt would cost him maybe $5. A dozen milk cans at 50 cents each, $6. Lumber for a platform, maybe $8 in materials. Total cost, less than $20. He'd lost more than that in reduced milk production just this past week. "I'll take it," Jake said. "All of it." He loaded his truck with salt, milk cans, and stopped at the lumber yard for 2x4s and plywood. By the time he got home, it was almost noon. Helen met him at the door. "Where have you been?" "I was worried." "Getting help," Jake said. "And I'm going to need your help too. We're taking over the back porch." They worked together all afternoon. Helen cleaned out the ceramic crocks she used for pickles and sauerkraut. 4 big crocks, each one holding about 20 pounds of feed. Jake went to the barn and scraped out feed from the unfrozen edges of his bins, brought it into the house, filled the crocks. That was 3 days of feed, right there in the house where it would never freeze. Then he went back to the barn and started building. The platform wasn't fancy, just a sturdy frame of 2x4s with plywood on top, 3.5 feet off the barn floor. He positioned it where the animal heat would rise most directly from the cattle below. By evening milking time, he had it done and had moved his main feed bins up onto it. After evening milking, he mixed salt through his feed supply. 2 pounds per 100 pounds, just like Henry said. He worked it through thoroughly with a scoop shovel, making sure it distributed evenly. His arms ached, his back hurt, but for the first time in 2 weeks he felt like he was fighting back instead of just surviving. That night at supper, Helen asked him what was going on. "Making changes," Jake said. "Going to fix this feed problem once and for all." The next morning, Jake woke at 4:30. He dressed in the dark, pulled on his coveralls, and headed out to the barn with his lantern. The thermometer read 22 below, brutal cold, the kind of cold that made your lungs hurt when you breathed. He opened the feed room door and held his lantern up to the elevated bins. The feed wasn't loose and flowing, it was still cold, still somewhat frozen, but when he grabbed a scoop shovel and dug in, the shovel went through. The feed broke up. It was manageable. Not easy, but manageable. 10 minutes of work and he had enough for morning feeding. Not 90 minutes with a pickaxe, 10 minutes with a shovel. He walked back to the house and filled a bucket from the crocks on the back porch. This feed was perfect, loose, dry, easy to handle. He carried it out to the barn and fed his cows. They ate eagerly. For the first time in weeks, morning feeding felt normal. Over the next 3 days, Jake refined his system. He learned that he needed to refill the house crocks every evening, not let them run empty. He learned that the feed in the elevated bins stayed more usable if he stirred it every afternoon, breaking up any sections that were starting to freeze together. He learned that on the coldest nights, he needed to bring extra feed into the house. Not just 3 days' worth, but 4 or 5 days' worth. But it worked. Morning feeding stopped being a crisis. It became routine again. A week later, Henry Schmidt stopped by to check on him. "How's it going?" Henry asked. Jake showed him the system, the elevated platform, the house storage, the milk cans he was using for daily rotation. Henry nodded approvingly. "You figured out the timing piece too, I see." "Yeah," Jake said. "Late afternoon transfers work way better than trying to do it first thing in the morning." "That's the key most farmers miss," Henry said. "They try to muscle through problems with brute force when they should be working with the natural rhythms. Cold is coldest before dawn. Heat is highest in late afternoon. Work with it, not against it." By February, Jake's milk production was back up to 95% of normal. Not quite where it had been, but close enough. More importantly, he wasn't spending hours every day fighting frozen feed. The system worked. It required discipline. It required daily effort moving feed from barn to house and back, but it was manageable effort, not crisis management. Other farmers started asking questions. How was Jake keeping his production up when everyone else was struggling? He showed them. Some copied his elevated platform design. Others started keeping feed in their houses. Jim Henderson at the feed store started stocking more agricultural salt after 5 farmers asked for it in 1 week. The knowledge spread, not through university extension bulletins or government pamphlets, through farmers talking to farmers, through one neighbor helping another, through shared struggle creating shared solutions. That spring, when Jake tallied up his books, he'd made it through. Barely. His profit margin was thin. But he'd made his mortgage payment. He'd kept his cows healthy. He'd kept his family fed. And he'd learned lessons that would serve him for the rest of his farming career. The following fall, Jake approached harvest completely differently. He borrowed a moisture tester from the extension office. He checked his corn daily as it dried in the field. He waited until moisture was below 16% before he started harvest, even though this meant going later than some neighbors. He'd learned that preventing problems was easier than fixing them. He also built a proper corn crib with slatted sides for air circulation. It cost him $120 and 3 weekends of labor, but it gave him a place to store corn where air could flow through, letting it continue drying naturally even after harvest. The corn he put into storage that fall was dry and problem-free. The winter of 1953 to 54 was just as cold as the previous one. But Jake experienced none of the frozen feed nightmares. His system of elevated storage, house rotation, salt treatment, and proper grain drying worked exactly as designed. He'd invested modest money and daily discipline into solving the problem permanently. What Jake discovered that brutal winter was something every successful farmer eventually learned. Agriculture wasn't about fighting nature. It was about understanding nature and working within its rules. Cold air sinks, heat rises, moisture binds grain particles, salt lowers freezing points. These weren't secrets, they were principles. Once you understood the principles, solutions became obvious. The techniques Jake used weren't high-tech, no electricity required, no fancy equipment, just observation, understanding, and practical application. A farmer in Wisconsin in 1953 had access to the same solutions a farmer in Minnesota in 1893 would have used. The knowledge had been there all along, passed down through generations. shared in feed stores and over coffee, proven through hard winters and desperate experiments. But knowledge only helped if you sought it out, listened to it, and applied it. Jake could have kept swinging that pickaxe, kept losing production, kept sliding toward foreclosure. Instead, he'd swallowed his pride, asked for help, and learned from men who'd faced the same battles. Years later, when Jake's grandson visited the old farm, now owned by someone else, he found some of those original milk cans still in the barn. They were holding nails now, repurposed as storage containers. He asked his grandfather about them. Jake told him the story. The brutal winter, the frozen feed, the morning he thought he'd lose everything, the afternoon at Henderson's feed store when Henry Schmidt and the others taught him the old ways. "So you saved the farm with milk cans and salt?" his grandson asked somewhat incredulously. "I saved the farm by understanding the problem and being willing to change," Jake said. "The milk cans and salt were just tools. The real solution was up here." He tapped his head. Learning, adapting, not being too stubborn to ask for help. The grandson, who'd studied agricultural engineering in college, recognized that what his grandfather described was practical thermodynamics and moisture science. Elevated storage captured thermal stratification. Salt altered freezing point depression. Multiple smaller containers managed thermal mass more effectively. His grandfather had figured out legitimate scientific principles through observation and experimentation without ever taking a physics class. "They don't teach that in college," the grandson said. "No," Jake agreed. "They teach you the science, but farming teaches you how to apply it when everything's going wrong and you're out of time and money. That's a different kind of education." The frozen feed crisis of the early 1950s forced thousands of farmers across the northern United States to innovate or fail. Some failed. Tom Hendrickson wasn't the only farmer who lost his land because he couldn't solve winter feeding problems, but many more succeeded, learning techniques that became standard practice for decades afterward. These solutions remained relevant long after the specific crisis passed. Even today, with climate-controlled storage and sophisticated grain handling systems, the principles matter. Moisture control still determines storage success. Temperature management still affects outcomes. Understanding the relationship between environment and grain condition remains essential. But the bigger lesson was about agricultural knowledge itself and how it spread. The dramatic innovations that historians write about, the mechanical reapers and hybrid corn and rural electrification, those changed farming visibly and dramatically. But the quiet knowledge shared around feed store stoves, the techniques passed from neighbor to neighbor, the practical solutions to daily problems, that knowledge was equally important. That knowledge kept farms running during the gaps between big innovations. Jake Morrison farmed successfully for another 20 years after that winter. He expanded his herd. He bought adjacent land when a neighbor retired. He sent all 3 of his kids to college. When he finally retired and sold to a young couple in 1973, his farm was prosperous and productive. But he never forgot that morning with the pickaxe fighting frozen feed and losing. And he never forgot the afternoon at Henderson's, when other farmers taught him the solutions that saved everything. For the rest of his life, when young farmers asked him for advice, he always told them the same thing. Learn the principles, ask questions, don't be too proud to admit you don't know something. And remember that farming is problem solving. The problems change, but the need to solve them never does. That wisdom, born from crisis and refined through experience, represented the best of American agricultural tradition. Self-reliance paired with community support, respect for traditional knowledge combined with willingness to innovate, hard work guided by smart thinking. These values kept farms alive and families fed through brutal winters, economic depressions, and all the challenges that came with working the land. Thank you for watching this documentary about how American farmers in the 1950s solved the frozen feed crisis that threatened their livelihoods. If you found this story engaging and educational, please subscribe to our channel for more content about agricultural history and rural American life. Give this video a like and share it with others who appreciate learning how farmers overcame real challenges in an era before modern technology. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. This video is inspired by real events and historical farming practices from 1950s rural America. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individual or community. Jake Morrison is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar feed-freezing challenges during this era. The techniques and solutions described are based on documented farming practices and oral histories from the period. While we strive for historical accuracy, this presentation is educational in nature and should not be taken as comprehensive agricultural advice for modern farming operations.